Christos anesti negrum fanato fanatum pati.
Ukraine. I wrote that article originally for Orthodox Word because I had this feeling that this was before any of this stuff was cut, even before this whole uh, schism with Bartholomew, Patriarch Bartholomew, and all that. It hadn't even come up before yet. It was kind of in the air, but I really felt that very few people know any history. Especially, they know very little about the history of Russia, of Ukraine, practically nothing. And since I'd studied that in university, the history of Russia, starting with the very beginning, we're talking about the warring tribes before they were baptized. We're talking about, not actually at that time, the area that's mostly the area that's now Ukraine. Novgorod, Kiev, these different tribes. And then the baptism of Russia, and then the chroniclers, um, who who reported, who fixed all this, the history of Rus. They call Rus. Rus is what is now Belarusia, Ukraine, and Russia. All of those together. Um, and how that all came to be, I decided, well, I was looking around for some kind of English article in English that would explain all this, a history from the Orthodox point of view, coming, through the church. There's plenty of history books about Russia, but they're not written by Orthodox people, by Orthodox Christians. They're just history books. Um, I'm talking about literature in English, and in Russian, of course, there's plenty. But I thought I couldn't find any, so I thought, well, I'll just write one myself. So I wrote that article, and I hope that it wasn't an easy thing to write, because I had to really start researching all these different things and search and sift through stuff that could be thought of as mythological or whatever. But I feel like I got some pretty good sources, and before I even started it, I got some advice from a church historian, Father Vladislav Tsipin, who's considered one of these people who, if you want to know about church history, it's sort of like your go-to person to talk to about history of the church, not only in Russia but all over Christendom. Um, and we sat down, and he gave me some tips, and he told me some good sources to go to, and reliable things, and especially, and about the early years of Russian history, but then also about recent years, about this whole schism, where it started, how it ended up, some kind of the behind the scenes things that were going on, because he was actually involved in preparation for the councils, um, that decided about Ukrainian autocephaly. So he had insider information, so to speak. So I thought he was a good person. So I feel like I did the best of my ability of getting the right information on it. Probably one thing that I left out that should have been more information included, is just how in the Ukraine, especially Western Ukraine, the Unionism started reviving after the breakup of the Soviet Union, when Ukraine became an independent country. Um, I discussed the idea of Unionism in the article. How it was a big problem because of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and how they were all Catholic, and they were sort of at war with Orthodoxy in the lands that then they took into their empire, which is now part of the Ukraine, Western Ukraine. And but one thing that was a little bit unclear was how is it that right after Ukraine broke up, suddenly unionism started flaring up again, so to speak, in some of these Western cities. Um, it was actually rather violent. I know people who lived there and had to leave because they didn't want to become unionists. They had to flee the country, move to Russia, or move further east in Ukraine. Um, Priests were under great pressure to become unionists. It was a very difficult time for people then. And how did that sort of get revived is a little bit sort of left unsaid because, um, when the units of Western Ukraine ended up coming under the Soviet Union, and because they were so bound up with the Nazis, like the Galician, they had an actual SS force that was consisted of Galicians, right around Lvov, and then in Volhynia, and all sorts of atrocities were committed, war crimes and stuff like that. Um, Stalin came down very hard on them. Uh, they'll never forget what was done to them, of course. A lot of them ended up in Canada, in the United States, the ones that were able to escape before it became part of the Soviet Union. And Stalin did anything he could to completely squash that whole movement, right? They were forced to become Orthodox. Um, but so there really weren't that many unions when Ukraine became an independent country. So where did they all come from? It begs the question. Um, how did that become such a huge movement again? Did they suddenly remember that they were unionists before they were forced to become Orthodox, or did somebody remind them, you know, from Canada, from, or from some other place? That's a question, right? Uh, but anyways, that was one. You know, I wanted people to have just a little bit more, be not quite so completely ignorant of the fact that um, at one time all of Russia, Rus, was one people, and that there wasn't this huge division between them, and that they weren't at enmity with each other. This was not a It just was not a thing in those days. Um, that they came from the same baptismal font. Uh, this is not a political statement. This is just an historical statement, right? Now, unfortunately, history has been highly politicized in our days. People use a rewriting of history as a political tool. You know, if in all the schools they're giving you one particular kind of history, then children are raised to think one way or another, or to view some other nationality or some other nation in one particular way, as an enemy or as a friend, or even as something that can be completely ignored. It all comes down to that, politicizing history. But history's history. It happened one way or it didn't, right? That's why I believe that real history, is a very important thing to study. Um, we all know, even in the United States, we have certain ways that history is presented to us in the schools. Uh, there's certain things about our own history that are taught to us that may or may not be even correct, um, or may have been certain things downplayed, certain things ignored. That's the way it happens in this whole tendency to make history into a political sort of tool, or a way to teaching history is a way for people to think about themselves as a nation. And so I just really wish that people would understand that that this enmity is a between Russians and Ukrainians is a very recent thing, and um, it's a very painful thing, most of all for Russians. I can't even tell you how painful it is for Russians to have Ukrainians hating them. You know, uh, because there's mixed families everywhere. You look in Russian everywhere in Russian politics, politicians, famous Russians, so to speak, Russians, they have Ukrainian surnames. Anybody who knows about Russia and knows Russian, they know you can discern between a Ukrainian surname, typical, and everything else. They're all over Russia, and they're in the government. Um, People used to go, always used in Soviet times, especially in church life, there was absolutely no distinction between Ukrainians and Russians. None. On the feast days of Saint Sergius of Radonezh, half the laver would be packed with Ukrainians. They would come up from Ukraine to be in the laver on that day. On various feast days of the Kiev Caves laver, all the Russians would run down there. Just really was not a thing. The Pskov Cave Monastery had more than half of the brothers were Ukrainian. The monasteries still in Russia have many Ukrainians. Ukrainians are actually very religious people. They're very strong Orthodox. They almost had to be. Their history made them. They forged them into very strong Orthodox people. So this Ukrainian spirituality has always been very important in the Russian space, you know. And to have this hatred is actually a very painful thing for a lot of Russians. So I wish that people would understand that, you know. Um, that's kind of all. That's really all I have to say about that because this whole situation now is so politically charged. You can't even say anything. You
Yeah,
kind of have to limit it to that.
yeah,
uh, yeah. So
yeah.
that's
Lord
that
have
was
mercy.
yeah that was that. And I being neither Russian nor Ukrainian, I adore Ukrainians. I've had very important people, spiritual fathers, spiritual instructors in my life were from Ukraine. Um, this has been, and if you look at the Russian Church abroad, many Ukrainians. I mean, Russian Church abroad came out of, you might say, the Jordanville came out of Chayev. Chayev is Western Ukraine. Ask any of those people in those days that came over to the United States and formed Jordanville, you know, are you a Ukrainian nationalist? Are you for Ukrainian spirituality church? They would look at you like you're crazy. They just considered themselves the Russian church, Um, the there was Bishop Andrei Rimarenko and all these different people, more lesser known ones that started the St. Joe Chayev printing press in Jordanville. Um, it just was, it just never was that way, you know.
Hmm.
So uh, I don't know. I don't know. And like during the Soviet times, to talk about a Ukrainian would be more like for us, like a Chicagoan to talk about a Texan, or something like that. It wasn't that they had their own specifics. They had a specific way of doing things. They had, their own language even and dialect. The language, by the way, is almost mutually understandable. Ukrainian and Russian, like for instance, Russians can watch Ukrainian speak on television and they don't need an interpreter. They understand what they're saying, and vice versa. Um, Sometimes Ukrainians in other parts of Ukraine are speaking really more like what you would call a dialect. It's not even a dialect of Russian. I mean, it's not even strictly Ukrainian language. It's just a very specific kind of Russian language, a local kind of language. Um, and they would have their sort of different way of going about things, just like a Chicagoan has a very different way of going about things from an Alabaman, you know. It's not to trivialize the difference, but I'm just saying that there's just not this huge difference that I think a lot of people perceive in the West. Like that somehow, I've even heard people in the West saying that under, when under the Soviet Union, Russia occupied the Ukraine, which of course, that's a strange way of putting it. The Ukrainians occupied the Ukrainians became Ukraine became a communist republic, part of the Union of Soviet republics. They were Ukrainians, just like Russians are Russians. They were running their own republic, right? Um, it just wasn't. It wasn't this thing that that we have now. It just wasn't. And I think that there's not. That's not to say that Ukrainians shouldn't have their own independent country. No, I mean I'm not saying that at all. But history moves on. Things happen. But the people, I've always felt that that they should be together spiritually. However that pans out, right? It's up to them. It's up to God. They should make their own choice without any outside influence. Uh, we're not the
Yep.
ones to tell them what to do.
Yep.
I, so